Here we are, my young friends. Good day to you all. It's so nice to have you join me in my home. I hope that you can see and hear me as we get started. I know, also, I'm not as young as I once was, so I hope you'll appreciate if I sit for part of this. Are we comfortable? Are we all with us? Wonderful. Welcome. My name is Benjamin Franklin, as our young friend Lindsay said. I know that brevity is the soul of wit and that we have limited time together, so I want to just go right into it and tell you some stories from my day. I cannot speak so much of your times, but I will do my best to tell you of mine. Before I do, I must tell you that I have tried throughout my long life to be virtuous, to live a virtuous life. And there is no greater virtue, I believe, than, well, how do I put this? Humility. And if one is well known and well traveled, it is often difficult to be humble. And I have been invited to talk to all of you about, well, about my life and my experiences, and that's not a very humble thing to do. So, having appreciated that I am trying to be humble, but at the same time, how can I tell you of my experiences with that in mind? I was born in Boston town. I think many of you are from Massachusetts. It's so good to see my fellow Massachusetts Bay Colony residents. I've always found it the Massachusetts style, the New England manner to bring a great refreshment, being here in Philadelphia for so long, and its Quaker sensibilities. It's not quite as, well, as my father always said, Josiah, frank. That is who we are. We're Franklins. We are frank. So I am the 10th son to my father, Josiah. I have 9 older brothers. I also have 7 sisters. And as the 10th son, I was what was known as a tithing baby. That is to say that I was expected to be given as a tithe to the church. This was actually rather advantageous because at the age of 9, I was sent to school, something none of my brothers or sisters had been able to do. And this was to teach me Latin, to prepare me for Harvard and eventually a career in the ministry. That was when I was 9 years old. By the time I was 10, less than a year later, it became clear that I was not going to be a minister. So I was taken out of school. I was apprenticed to my older brother, James, as a printer. And that would serve me well as a career and as an avocation. So at 17, I left Boston. I went to, well, actually, I left Boston and I went to New York and I couldn't find a job. And then I went on to walk across New Jersey to Philadelphia, where I did find a job, but I only remained 1 year. And then at the age of 18 years old, I went off to London. In my first voyage across the sea, I returned to Philadelphia less than 2 years later, and that voyage home was a very important moment in my life. I really began to reevaluate. I began to see that up until that point, I had received no journeyman papers. I had no wife. I had no occupation to speak of. I was trained as a printer, but no job was waiting for me. And that is when I began to keep my first journal. Now, this is not that journal. I've had hundreds of journals since then. But in every one of those journals, since that first one on that ship returning from England, I have been writing down a list of virtues. And these virtues, there were initially 12 of them, but you might be able to see that there. There's my list of virtues. These virtues have served me well, and they have been my guide. Now, it has been difficult to be virtuous. I'm not going to read you my list of virtues. That would be terribly boring. But what I've done is I've created a mathematical equation that allows me to determine whether I am living a virtuous life. I call it my moral algebra, or my moral compass. So, eventually, I came back to Philadelphia. I was almost 20 years old. I did get married soon after to Debbie Reed and moved in with her father and mother, who fortunately passed on soon after. I say fortunately because they didn't like me at all. But Debbie and I were able to start a business together, a printing interest. And I began to print deeds and works for the Pennsylvania Assembly, and eventually took over a newspaper. I could not have accomplished any of this without Debbie. I cannot speak of that enough. It was also at this time that I decided to introduce something I had seen in London. Oh my, something I had seen in London, which is the club. You see, our friend Sir William Keith had something called the TIFF Club in London. And so I recreated it in Philadelphia, found a group of like-minded young working men like myself, printers. We called ourselves the Leather Apron Club. And soon after, we were joined by others, a lawyer, a ship's captain, and we renamed ourselves the Junta. And this comes back to my Latin learnings, though I shall not in any way claim to be great at Latin, having only been educated for that 1 year when I was 9. But junta, as you may know, means joined together, or fraternity. And this became my watchword, my personal motto, junta juvent, joined together, they assist. Let me say it again. Joined together, they assist. Junta juvent. And this would be the second great lesson in my life. Be virtuous, and you should be happy. Join with others, you will accomplish much. And so together with my club of Junta, we began to create institutions, academies, all sorts of new ideas that would help us discover the truth and benefit our fellow man. We started with a library. I don't know if you can see, but I'm here in my study, and there's a big pile of books there. I actually will have, at this point in my life, one of the largest libraries in the world. Let's see what we have here. Oh, Shakespeare. I've already quoted the bard. Oh my goodness, I have a candle very close to my books. You probably can't see any of this from your angle, my friends. I also should tell you, I cannot see or hear you at all. So I do hope that you can see and hear me all right. So we founded a library, the very first lending library, excuse me, in the colonies. And we had made a list of books. We wanted books about geography and books about architecture and history. Soon after, from our library, we founded what we called the Philosophical Society, the American Philosophical Society. Think you may be more familiar with the French translation of the word philosophical, which of course is science. So we founded America's first science academy. Excuse me. I assure you it's just water, my friends. I am known as the Water American, both for my love of swimming and my perchance to drink water. So the American Philosophical Society, now we can support other philosophers, other scientists. One of our first missions was to support our friend and astronomer, David Rittenhouse. He was going to help study the transit of Venus and map the solar system, or rather measure the solar system. Then we support, our friend John Bartram, the great botanist, who traveled all over the colonies collecting and naming plants. He named the Franconia tree for me. He named the wisteria bush for our friend Caspar Wister, another member of the Academy. Later still, the Academy would help to sponsor our young friend Meriwether Lewis on his journeys across the continent. But that's long after my time. Well, not that long after, but considering me old. It's all right. I'm often the oldest person in the room. And at 314, I don't see that will change soon. So, we have a science academy, we have a library, and we continue onward. We found America's first hospital. This would be very useful because not only would we be able to treat the ill free of charge, but we would also have doctors come together to study one another's works, to improve medicine. And this would become so crucial in the 1740s, just around the time I was retiring, when our city and many of our cities were plagued by epidemics. But fortunately, our doctors were well trained by that point, often in Scotland or France. In 1730s, I jumped ahead to when I retired in 1740, but in 1730s, I began to publish a small almanac. And I would love to have more time to talk about the almanac. And I must tell you, this small, here I have, oh yeah, 1730, this is the very first issue of my small almanac, Poor Richard. I would often say, the name Benjamin Franklin shall be long forgotten, but the name Richard Saunders will continue. My Poor Richard, that little pamphlet, that little almanac, filled with its wonderful little quips and mottos and credos, became an enormous success. And with its great success, I published it from 1733 to 1747. I sold tens of thousands of copies a year. And with it, I was able to retire. At the age of 41 years old, I sold my business to my partner, and I would devote the rest of my life to gentlemanly pursuits. I would do something that very few people had done before. I would rise in station. I was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly. I now must admit that with a rise in station also comes the duty to serve as, I dread saying the word, but yes, I would become a politician, taking over our postal service and serving the colony of Pennsylvania. I mentioned that we had founded a science academy, and with that academy, we were able to communicate with other academies and science institutes around the world, the Académie Française in Paris, the great scientists working in Milano and Edinburgh, and of course the Royal Society in London. And one of my good friends at the Royal Society was a man named Peter Collinson. And we used to take these plants of Bartram's and we would ship them to Peter. And he would ship us back interesting things. So we had a chiaroscura from the Royal Academy, and we had an air pump. And in 1748, 49, Peter sent me a wonderful new invention, a new device, a contraption, a contrivance, an instrument from the University of Leiden, created by a Professor Musselbach. And it was known as a Leyden jar. I must have, well, I'm not going to show you a Leyden jar because they're very, very dangerous. But imagine a small glass jar, and one can fill it with electrical fluid by simply taking a piece of wool and rubbing it on a glass tube. And then you would touch it to the Leyden jar, and you would create a small burst of a little part of electrical fluid would appear. And Peter said, maybe you would like to play around with this Leyden jar and figure out how it works and what sort of things it can do. And he was right. It would consume me. The next few years, I would spend studying the properties of electrical fluid. And I would come to discover some rather remarkable things about this substance. I mentioned that I was called the Water American, and I have always loved water. I am an avid swimmer. We would swim in the Mill Street Pond in South Boston, where I grew up. I drink water. And so I had studied fluid dynamics even as a child with the wonderful works of Thevenot. Now I would approach this electrical fluid in the same way that I approached the study of water or waves. And that's one of the things I discovered, is that electricity does flow in a wave. I will, of course, call it a current of electricity. I can store electricity. I can take that little Leyden jar and I can fill it with quicksilver. I think you call it mercury. And I can store enough electricity so that I can take a roasting spit and turn it, powered only by the electrical fluid, over a fire for 45 minutes. And I call that electrical storage unit, well, it's these rows of jars. You have to sort of picture it in a wooden box with wonderful little wires of copper running through it. And the jars look a little bit like the old balustrade, the old forts that would sit up on the Dorchester Heights and Breeds Hill above Boston. And we used to call those rows of cannons that sit up on top of the fort batteries. So that is what I called it. I called it a battery, and it stored electricity, and it was useful. This was the point. This was something my mother Abaya had always said to me. Benny, be useful. So I had found a way to take this electrical fluid and create a contrivance, an instrument that could be useful to people. There was a problem, which is that at any time you touched the instrument in its rotation, you would instantly die. So that is not going to be very useful. But I would send the design on to a very good instrument maker, a friend in Milano named Alfonso Volta. And Signore Volta would take the instrument and he would improve on it greatly. So if you're going to do some work with batteries, I do recommend my friend Signore Volta's. They're far less dangerous. Suffice to say that I was able to, along with other scientists, both here in Philadelphia, Ebenezer Kernsley, and around the world, I was able to come up with a comprehensive study of electricity. I discovered that it not only flies along like a current, like a wave, but it also appears in bursts, in little parts. We call them particles. And and I discovered that with iron or magnets, if I get a piece of iron, I can in fact take a big, this is just an old key I have lying around, I can take a big piece of iron like this, and with enough electrical fluid, I can magnetize it. I can turn it into a lodestone, into a magnet. And with the magnet, I can direct the electricity. I can move electricity. I can direct it as if I were directing an orchestra. So that, of course, we will call the conductor. I could go on and on this subject, my friends, but suffice to say that in 1752, I published a small pamphlet, an essay called Observations and Experiments with Electricity. And this is where it becomes hard to be humble, because with the publication of this small essay, which was republished the following year in London, and then in Paris, and then in Stockholm, and then throughout the world, with the publication of this small pamphlet with its 130 separate experiments, I would become a sensation. I would be feted by kings and queens, offered invitations to universities and honorary doctorates. I would go from being the printer Benny Franklin of South Boston to the great Dr. Franklin, the man who took lightning from the sky. Because of course that was the 130th experiment, that I had found that lightning, what had previously believed to have been an angry god throwing balls of fire at us, was now an explainable phenomenon, something that could be guarded against with the lightning rod. And there'll be lightning rods on top of buildings all over the world. Within 5 years of my publication, we have lightning rods as far away as Hong Kong. Everywhere but Boston. In Boston, they are preaching from the pulpits that my lightning rod is undermining the will of God. I have suggested that perhaps you should find yourself a more willful God, but they have said that it is my fault. But everywhere else in the world, my lightning rod has been embraced. Franklin's lightning rod. I even got a letter of congratulations from the Tsarina of Russia, Catherine well, we'll call her Catherine the Mediocre. Don't, if anyone's a friend with her, don't tell her I said that. My point is that you are familiar with Copernicus. Copernicus discovered that the Earth is revolving around the sun, a heliocentric solar system. Newton, who expanded on that idea and discovered the elliptical orbits of the planets. These men received great disdain for their beliefs. But with my discoveries, as well as my friend Joseph Priestley, who discovered that this is not just the miasma, but is chemicals, with my other friends, we were no longer being exiled or fined or imprisoned for our new beliefs. We were not seen as a challenge to the established of religion, rather a greater understanding of God's wonder, of divine providence. This moment where science is no longer seen as a threat to religion, it's a very important moment. This is what we would call the age of enlightenment. Enlightenment. And if we are so enlightened as to believe that science is not a threat to religion, then perhaps certain leaders, certain families, certain dynasties are not placed on earth to rule over the rest of us. Soon after my great fame, I was offered the position as representative for the colony of Pennsylvania to the Court of St. James. And I would leave Philadelphia and I would move back to London, where I would remain for 14 years. And during the next 14 years, the world would go through a great number of changes. As you are no doubt aware, it is in that period that the notions of independency and revolution would begin to ferment in the colonies. It was also at this point that my great successes and fame, which had always served me well, began to take a personal toll. During this period, both my son and my daughter were married, and I was not able to attend either of their nuptials, their weddings. Also, towards the end of my stay in London, my dear Debbie was lost to us after over 34 years of marriage, and I was not able to be with her at the end. Soon after, I returned to Philadelphia. A lot of people wondered, having spent so much time in London and in England, whether I would join the cause of independency. My own son was the royal governor of New Jersey. He chose to stay loyal to the king. I did not. I was elected to the Second Continental Congress, where it became rather obvious that as we entered a phase of embracing independency, declaring ourselves a new nation, that I, of course, shall be the primary author. I am well written, I am well read. That, of course, is not what happened. It was our friend from Virginia, Mr. Lee, Richard Henry, who said, Ben will not have you be its principal author, lest you put a joke in it. They may have been correct. So young Thomas did a very good job, and we soon after found ourselves with this is not the Declaration of Independence. Oh, this is the Declaration of Independence. We very soon found ourselves with a unanimous Declaration of Independence. Let's see. Oh, here, I'll show you this. This is the copy that Richard Matlack made. I don't know if you can see that. Richard Matlack, doesn't he have beautiful handwriting? And that's the one we all signed. This is the copy that we read. This is a printed, but here you can see how useful printers are. See how much easier it is to read John Dunlap's printed copy of the Declaration of Independence? This we did not sign. We printed about 200 of these. I'm sure you can find them. So, right after, I had only been back to America less than a year when I was elected to the Continental Congress. And between coming back to America and helping young Tom edit the Declaration, I had already gone up to Massachusetts to check on our good friend General Washington and his encampment, and had gone on to Canada to see if we could convince them to join our cause. We could not. But I, soon after this, we published this in July of 1776. It was just a week later, I helped design America's very first currency. I'm sure I didn't print, this was printed by my old business partner, David Hall. You can see that we printed America's very first currency. There's a $7 bill from, oh, you probably can't read this at all, from July, I don't know if you can see this. Take a picture of that. From July 1776. Rather proud of that work. And just after, so that was July, and by September, I was on my way back to Europe as our first minister to France. Over the next almost 9 years, I would live just outside Paris in a little town called Passy with my grandson Temple, and we would swim on the Seine. And the French, they gave me a palace, and they treated me as if I were a friend of the king. I played chess with the king. If you're ever invited to play chess with the king, I do recommend that you let them win. They prefer that. I danced with the queen, dear sweet Marie Antoinette, poor dear woman, so lovely, a good musician, played the harp, and I played the violin, so we often accompanied each other. I was able to, the French have really quite fallen in love with me, and I was able to lure them into our cause. More importantly, I was able to keep other powerful countries and empires out of our cause. Sweden, as I mentioned, Russia, as I mentioned. I think that it was at this time in my late 70s that I accomplished what would be most important, a treaty with the English that would end the war for independence in 1783, for all of my accomplishments, the summer of 1783 was the very time in that summer that I helped to write and draft the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war for independence and gave, more importantly, gave America complete autonomy throughout all of its colonies, all the way up to the Mississippi River, not including the Mississippi River, but up to its eastern shore. And that was the same month that I began to notice my eyesight failing. And so I was always, as I would sit at my desk and people would visit, I would always have to take on, I'll show you. I would have these glasses that were designed with a convex lens, and I would be able to read, and then I would take them off, and I would have to open up the lenses, and I would put on my other glasses. Now I can see you coming into there you are. Now I can see you. And then I would have to take off these glasses to go back to writing letters. Oh, you want to see something funny? Watch a 314-year-old man bend over to pick up a walking stick. So the point is that in that same time that I was helping to see our treaty, I was also inventing a new kind of eyeglasses, which I call the bifocal. It was also at that time that my young friends, paper makers in Paris, the Montgolfier brothers, Jacques and Jean, that's not their names, no, something like that. They invented the first hot air balloon. I stood next to the Queen of France as I watched the very first launch of a hot air balloon with a duck inside it. Later, just a couple months later, we would have people inside. I thought that hot air balloon would end war and be an excellent way to deliver the mail. I was wrong on both fronts. The point is that it was a really incredible time. I was so fortunate to have lived to see it. Not surprising, both my father and mother lived into their late 70s. Franklins are hard to kill. I returned to America in 1783, later that year, 1784, and I was once again elected, this time to the Pennsylvania Assembly. In fact, I was the host to what we call the Pennsylvania Convention, what you call the Constitutional Convention. I mean host in that the night before our first session, all 50 original delegates came to my house for dinner. I lived closest and had a big house at the time, and my daughter Sally was our hostess. The very next day, on the very first session, I purposely stayed home in the fear that I would be elected as president of the Congress, which would not have been a good idea. I was not a young man, and I am very fortunate that my dear friend, General Washington, was elected instead. I participated in the Constitutional Convention, but I must be frank, as I promised at the beginning of this tirade that I would do. Constitution is imperfect. It is an imperfect document created by imperfect men. I have become the president of a society that hopes to see the abolition of the holding of free Africans in bondage. And our Constitution is far too much of a compromise to see that eventual action come to fruition. So I am willing and able and going to sign the Constitution, but its greatest feature, in my opinion, is its amendability, is its ability to change. But I am not a young man, and my great glory days are long behind me. So we shall let younger men, our friends, Mr. Hamilton and our friends, Mr. Madison, we all have cute little nicknames for one another, and we call young Mr. Madison Little Jemmy. Don't feel bad for him. They call me Dr. Fatsides. So not long after, I would, oh, how to be delicate about this? I should quote the bard. I will cast off my mortal coil and hope that history remembers me fondly. I do want to end with, and people always expect me to quote myself. I think, as I said, Richard Saunders is far more quotable than I. But I did, in my journal, find something which I marked. I hope I put this in the right place. Wouldn't this be entertaining to watch an old man read a journal? So let's see. Oh, I did. I marked this. So I thought I would end by quoting myself. That's not very humble, is it? Here we are. I have sometimes wished, let's put this down and really put all of our focus on you. I have sometimes wished that it had been my destiny to be born 2 or 3 centuries hence. For inventions, improvements are prolific and beget more of the kind. That I might have my curiosity satisfied in knowing what is to be. That is tempting. That is seductive. Of course, such is not to be. So I must remain content in knowing that though I cannot glean the future, perhaps from time to time, my descendants, our descendants, will glance back toward us. So I want to thank you all, my friends, for spending some time learning a little bit about my life and glancing backward. Thank you. I should be tipping my hat to you. Now, I know that we're all going to stay on and we're going to answer and ask questions, which I'm very fond of. Hold on, I must do this properly. As if there might be royalty here. Hold that thought. All right, goodness gracious. All right. I was going to tell you all about my first discoveries of weather, since the weather here in Philadelphia is terrible. All right, here we are. I'll toss my hat to you. Thank you. Thank you. I know I cannot hear it, that there is thunderous applause going on the other side.
Thank you, Ben, for being with us today. I'm wondering, how many children did you have? Perhaps I missed the book of it.
I had 3 children. My first son, William, who we called William, he didn't like being called Billy so much, would go on to join me in England. He would take the bar and become an attorney in England, and then would become America's first American-born royal governor of this colony of New Jersey. And when I joined the cause of independency, he stayed loyal to the king and eventually would be imprisoned by our friend General Washington in Hartford. And then I would always say that William chose the king over his own father, and so I would disown him, leave him nothing at the end of my life, except a worthless piece of land I had in Canada called Halifax, where he will become neighbors with our friend, the former Commandant of Philadelphia, General Benedict Arnold. So the 2 of them shall be very happy together. Then I had my daughter Sally, Sarah, we called her Sally, and Sally was the most delightful and intelligent and sweet woman and girl that you have ever met. She would become the president of an auxiliary that would sew hundreds of thousands of shirts for our Continental soldiers. She would marry a printer and would have wonderful children. One of her sons, she named Benjamin Franklin Bache. And Sally's children and grandchildren continue on to this day. One of my 9th great-grandchildren recently graduated from the university that I founded, the University of Pennsylvania. And then we had a son, Francis, who we called Frankie. And unfortunately, Francis died at the age of 4 years old from smallpox. And that made me a great advocate for the inoculation process after losing Francis. And we were always very sad about that. That does not leave you. But having had 6 13 brothers and sisters, I thought having 2 grown children, both of whom would survive past me, was probably the wise thing to do. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Sally, dear Sally, I used to tell Sally, a man is like 1/2 a scissors, incomplete without his pair. And I'm very fortunate she found an excellent husband, Richard Bache. Anyone else?
If you were to look back on your long and famous life,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for being so, modest, relatively speaking, what would you say was your most important action or decision or invention? Any of those kinds of things you'd like to choose?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. I think the Treaty of Paris is definitely the most important thing I've ever done, without question. And it was wonderful that it came so late in life, in that I suppose my favorite invention, my favorite thing that I ever invented was called the glass harmonica. It was a musical instrument I invented, probably not the most useful. The glass harmonica is an interesting device. You play it. It is like my roasting spit. It is a series of crystal glasses on a spindle, which you turn and play, and it's very soft and delicate. It doesn't really go with a whole orchestra, but it does make a rather eerie noise. And because of the eerie noise, people thought that it caused brain fever and could kill you. The sound of my instrument. That's a long story. But they stopped playing the glass harmonica. And then when I was in France, a man named Monsieur Mesmer came to France and claimed that he could use the glass harmonica to cure things like blindness, that its eerie music had medical properties. And you have to remember, people are launching themselves into the air and all sorts of incredible things are happening. And this is an age where for the first time you can send a letter in Boston and it can arrive in London in just 6-8 weeks time. It's really a remarkable age of new ideas and new inventions. And so Mesmer's claims did not seem that incredible. And the king asked a group of us scientists to look into his claims, and we discovered that they were absolutely false. He is a charlatan, not hire Frederick Mesmer. But that really put a nail in the coffin of my glass harmonica. So that was always my favorite invention. Our young friend Mozart will play and compose for it. The Treaty of Paris is probably the most important thing I've ever done. And I think it was my small pamphlet on electricity that was my most popular of all of my, or rather most read of all of my discoveries.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of the information with us. I hope lots of school children can enjoy it too.
So how did Debbie, my wife Deborah, how did she impact your inventiveness? So 2 quick stories. First of all, when I started as a printer, before I had purchased the newspaper and started to print the Gazette, before the almanac, my only real work as a printer was some deeds and some wills for the Pennsylvania Assembly. It wasn't enough I would print some currency later, but it wasn't enough to maintain a business. And so Debbie would make stationery. We used to have to buy paper from England, and she would start to pulp her own paper, and eventually we would own a number of paper mills. And so Debbie really kept us going at the beginning. She was bringing in more money in the interest in our printing office than I was. And she also kept the books. Debbie is not the world's greatest writer. If you ever decide to read our letters, I've given them all to Yale College, so I think you can. But she had an excellent mind for numbers, and she always kept the account books. And every day, she would leave work, the office, which was down at 2nd and the Front Street, and we lived up on 3rd and Front Street, just a block away, and she would leave about 2 hours before me to prepare dinner. And in those early days when our children were still very young, we had a simple pine table with simple pewter bowls and a wooden spoon, and we would eat our dinner out of the same bowls, with the same spoon every night. 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, our sup, we called it, our midday sup. So one day I left the shop and I came home, and there in front of my place on the table, instead of my normal pewter bowl, was a beautiful Delft-made porcelain Dutch bowl. And instead of the wooden spoon was a silver spoon. And I said, "What's all this?" And Debbie said, "Well, you've been working so hard, my dear husband, and you might not realize it, but we are beginning to do well for ourselves. And I thought you should eat as well as any rich man about town. So I've gotten you this bowl and this spoon." Wasn't that sweet? No, it was not sweet. It was terribly, terribly spiteful and manipulative, because of course I'm not going to eat out of a beautiful china bowl and a beautiful silver spoon while she's still eating out of the wooden bowl with a wooden spoon. And so I said, "Debbie, you should take this." "No, no, you must." "No, no." And so I said, "Well, just buy another one." Well, now I've given her invitation to buy. Well, you can't have 2 nice bowls, because what if people come over? So you need a set of 10. And now they all look so beautiful, but on that old pine table, we need a big oak table. And the next thing you know, we have a bigger house, more furniture, and all because Debbie bought me that little silver spoon. That is how she impacted my, it's a terrible story. I know she loved that story. I know you had a big family. Can you tell us a little more about that? I would be happy to. I have, I should say, first of all, that my father was married twice, and I am of his second wife. Abaya is my mother. And we in the Franklin family never differentiated between first and second wives. So we were all the children of Josiah. And though a couple of my brothers were gone, and many of them had moved out of the house, we were all very close, and we remained very close throughout my life. And we all, for the most part, those of us who lived long. We are, as I said, hard to kill. So my oldest sibling is Elizabeth, who married and stayed in Boston, and I had the great pleasure of being able to purchase a house for her. And she was lived long enough to see and to benefit from my successes. Then I had 9 older brothers. One of them, John, had gone off to sea as a sailor, and he had disappeared. I never met him. And I always wanted to be a sailor, and it was always kept from me. I was always told, you can do anything you want, but you cannot be a sailor like your brother John. I mentioned James. James I spoke of a lot in my autobiography, who I apprenticed for. And James was a cruel master, but he was also a very good and qualified printer. And he would actually die in his 30s, and I would raise his son. And eventually I would own interest in printing offices all over the colonies, including one in Rhode Island, which my brother James's wife maintained. I have 2 printing offices that are owned and run by women, and eventually James's son would take over. But none of that compares to my dearest sibling, my sister Jane Meekum. Jane and I were inseparable. I mentioned that I gave all of my letters and papers to Yale College. That was another spiteful thing I did. I was angry at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, and Harvard turned down my papers. So I was up at Yale College in New Haven, and I was told that I had written letters to over 19,000 people in my lifetime. I had written close to 1 million letters, but that by far there were more letters written to my sister Jane than to anyone else. And Jenny and Benny, for those first 7 years of my life, I thought my name was Jenny and Benny. Jenny and Benny, we were inseparable, and we remained so throughout our life. Jenny has always been my closest friend. How long have you been, I'm sorry, I can't see it. You had a big family. Did you have any children that went on to become famous in any way? Well, that all depends on what you mean by famous. I think there's famous, and then, there's on money famous. My son, William, was imprisoned by George Washington and Royal Governor of New Jersey, first American-born royal governor. He was known. He lived in the shadow of my greatness, I must say. So humble. My grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, became a publisher and an owner of a newspaper which vehemently and adamantly called for the impeachment of George Washington as president. Benjamin Franklin Bache, he also wound up in prison, actually. And then my great-great-grandson, my great-great-granddaughter will marry the great-great-grandson of Pierre DuPont, the Swiss family, and they, my descendants, will become the DuPont family, and as I understand it, they own the state of Delaware. So perhaps not famous, but there are descendants of mine who have been very successful. I met another descendant of mine, direct descendant. I don't have, remember, I only had 2 living children, so though I have tens of thousands of nieces and nephews, having so many brothers and sisters, I do not have a lot of direct descendants. But I don't know if any of them were, get onto money famous. How long have you been portraying Ben Franklin? I should find that insulting. Portraying Ben Franklin. Yes, you're right. Being so well known and having your name so people do have an expectation, and I could say that ever since I published my observations and experiments on electricity, Benjamin Franklin has become something separate from myself. I am no longer the youngest son of a candle maker from Boston. I have become something else. And I have tried to use that for the benefit of others, be useful. Remember what I said, be useful. So I've tried to be useful. And when I got to Paris, the French were really quite enamored of me, and they wanted to imagine me as this sort of backwoods Quaker. I'm not a Quaker, I'm a Presbyterian, and so I would wear this old, right here, I would wear this old brown linen coat, and an old fur Marcatan hat. And I would, you probably can't hear me anymore, I'm far too far away. And I played the part, the Pennsylvania scientist. I used to spend a lot of time in France, sort of staring longingly out of windows. People loved that. Look at Benjamin Franklin, he must be discovering something amazing. But really, I was just thinking about how I could raise more money for the cause of independence. So yes, they would, in Paris, when I got there, every artist who ever asked me to pose for them, statues, Houdin, and painters, I would always pose for them. And they had these little medallions made of my face in profile, wearing the old fur cap and the old brown coat. And they would take these little medallions and they would affix them onto their carriages. And when they went riding around the Champ de Mars on Sundays for their afternoon rides, if you saw one of these medallions on a carriage with my picture, they would call out to each other, Liberté, liberty, or Bohème Richard, that's what they called me, the good Richard, Bohème Richard for my character. So yes, you're right, being Ben Franklin is like a betrayal, and has been so ever since I published that pamphlet and became so famous in 1752. What happened to your son, the loyal supporter? So this is a wonderful question. Young William, so I get to Paris. So William had helped me with my kite experiments and had been very useful in his early 20s, 20 or so, when I performed the kite experiment. And he had always been very, you're ever going to perform a dangerous experiment, that's what put your children at risk. That's what they're for. If you hire somebody, they'll sue you if they get injured, and you don't want to injure yourself. So, so he'd always been very helpful. And then we got to France, to London in the late 1740s. And I think, I was the youngest son of a candle maker. And I think William sort of had a different, he grew up he was wealthy and successful, and his father was so well known, and I think it opened doors for him. So when we came back, he came back before me, and he became royal governor. And then I returned to America, and I met with him and our friend Joseph Galloway, and I explained to them why I was joining the cause of independence. and William explained why he was going to stay loyal to the king. And then I went off to France. And then I got a letter from General Washington informing me that William had been thrown in prison. He was in Hartford, Connecticut, or New London, Connecticut. New London, we're going to have to change the name of that town. And he basically, Washington was asking, what should we do? So here's the problem. William Franklin is my son. He is famous for being the son of Benjamin Franklin. He is an American-born loyalist of the king. He is, in fact, really the highest ranking civilian authority for the king in the colonies. So he could become a sort of a watch, how do you put it, a magnet for likewise, he could raise the interests and excitement of other loyalists. So keeping him in prison is dangerous because it could incite loyalists. Releasing him, sending him off to England or off to Canada is certainly an option, but then he could, you know, he could raise a militia. He could raise money. He could fight, literally fight against us with his power. And of course, normally, because he is American born, the proper course of action for the general is to execute him, but Washington's not going to execute my son, Franklin. And he basically, Washington asks me, what should I do with your son? I often pose this to groups to see what they would do. And I, in given three choices, always try to find another way. And so what I responded to Washington, to the great general, was, you know, I always call him the great general or the old man, even though I am 27 years older than him. There is something about the gravitas and civility of General Washington. But I said to him, I wrote to him and I said, I would no more tell you what to do in your position as our commander-in-chief than I would expect you to tell me what to do as our chief ambassador to Europe or our minister to France. So I left the decision in General Washington's hands. And of course, he kept my son in prison for a few years and then eventually released him. And as I think I mentioned, I left for him land in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and then eventually William went on to London, where I believe he will live a short and miserable life. Sorry, I'm really quite, when I say he chose the king as his father over his father, I am not speaking in hyperbole. It was really quite harmful and hurtful. And yes. How many books did you write over your lifetime? I did write a couple of books. I'll leave that open. I did write a couple of books. I published many, many books. In fact, I always like to say that by the age of 7 years old, I had memorized the Bible. And so at the age of 22 or so, I was able to translate the Bible into German, and I published the first German Bible in America, not the first German Bible ever, the first German Bible published in America. Though I should say that the German population in Pennsylvania hated me and didn't really buy it, but that's a very long story. So I published hundreds of books and pamphlets and essays. I wrote a number of essays, but in my lifetime, I only really published 2, and of course, essays and magazine articles. I published the Gazette for 30 years and the Almanac, but I did collect a group of articles that I had written under various names. I wrote a gossip column under the name Alice Addertongue. And of course, I wrote the Silas Dogood letters when I was a boy. And I think I took on all told about 30 nom de plumes. So I did collect a series of essays, all having to do with money. I had one of my most popular little adages, or Poor Richard's most popular little adages, was time is money. It's short, but catchy. And so I published a series of essays about money and how to save money called Father Abraham's Dream. And then it was republished a couple years later under the name The Way of Wealth. And I really have to say that a lot of it's very sarcastic. So if you buy one and read it, do it with a grain of salt. But then later, I wrote my autobiography. And my autobiography is going to go, which was published after I passed to my request, because it was a little cruel to some of my siblings and my son. Much of what I'm telling you now, you can learn about it if you pick up my autobiography. I don't get any money from it, so not anymore. But I am told that my autobiography will ultimately become, for a while, for about 100 years or so, the second best-selling book in all of American history, after, of course, the Bible, and the best-selling biography ever written. So that's nice to know. People still are interested in my life and how I speak of it. I'm sure many other books have been written about me, and I'm sure they're all filled with nonsense. So I think that's the last question, and it may be that I've taken us to an hour. And let me just, oh no, thank you so much. I needed this, so many. Wait, this says, I can't read a damn thing. Oh, gout. Oh, thank you so much. I needed these many. Oh, that's so, you're very kind to say so. So thank you so much. So once again, my friends, Lindsay, I want to thank you so much for hosting me, and thank all of you who managed to stay with us throughout this experience. It has been my absolute pleasure.